in the Earth's system. And without that, there'd be no life on Earth. We'd just be freezing cold. The problem now is that these gases in the troposphere, and in particular CO2, carbon dioxide, they've increased dramatically as we've burnt more and more fossil fuels. And as we reduce the capacity of our land, in particular our forests, to absorb atmospheric CO2 via tall plant growth. And that then increases the thickness of this blanket. Like you could think of it as a clear bubble wrap, if you like. So it lets light through, but it also insulates against the loss of heat from the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's sort of biosphere. So that bubble wrap covers the Earth as it gradually is getting hotter and hotter. So not only our atmosphere, but also by heat transfer, our soils, our plants, our oceans, and even all the materials that make up our built environment, they all get hotter and warmer. Now, I guess now you're okay to be wondering, well, then why has this summer been so cool and mild? It's been almost cold, at least down here in Melbourne. And why have there been such bitter cold winters in Northern Europe in recent years? Well, the increased thermal energy that's gathered on the Earth's surface due to the thickening of that clear bubble wrap, or the greenhouse gases above it, that drives dramatic shifts in ocean and air currents, which in turn generate more energetic and extreme weather events. So they can be from single day weather events like storms. They could be week-long spells of, say, heavy rain or heat wave, right through to seasonal, decadal, and even permanent shifts in weather patterns. So it could be drought, for example. If we don't urgently address the human-induced heating up of our Earth system, and most immediately by stopping our use of fossil fuels, then these extreme weather events will make our ability to thrive on this planet more and more difficult. So that's weather. But our climate, on the other hand, has been very stable for many thousands of years. And that's until we began to really hook in with our burning of fossil fuels. So you can see here that our Earth's temperature trajectory has closely followed the shift in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So you can see here in the year 1000, right through to pretty well the year 1900, around that time when we started to really do a lot of burning of fossil fuels, particularly for industry, large-scale industry and increasing populations, the temperature has soared up quite a lot as the sort of the average global temperatures. Now, in the olden days, that was assessed by things like because we didn't have sort of we call it weather stations dotted all around the world, but we did have trees with growth rings, and we had ice cores that were still building and developing, and you could tell from those both CO2 concentrations, the speed of plant growth, and then compare that to see what was going on. I'm sure there are other kind of mechanisms as well that the scientists use and competently. But this sudden surge up in temperature since around through the 19th century and now into the 20th century now into the 21st, you'll see there's just a little blimp mid-century around when I and quite a few of us who are on the Zoom tonight were born. But what was actually happening there, I understand, is that we stopped creating a lot of particulates, so burning stuff like coal in a particularly dirty way, and we started to not burn so much oil directly, like for heating of homes and other kind of industry. And so with those particulate emissions taken out of the atmosphere, they were actually acting almost like a shield, and they. So what happens when that happened? As a further kind of, if you like, as a blanket element, and then they cause when they were no longer around, then but then of course we just raced on with the temperatures again. But you can see the CO2 concentrations just going up very evenly, but much so exponentially in the last sort of 150 years. And then some people you'll hear say, oh, look at a lot of this climate change and global heating is all about the sun. You know, the sun's brighter and there's more solar energy coming through that bubble wrap or the blanket down onto the earth. But you can see here, actually, that's not the case at all. That's the yellow line. So from in the last sort of 140 years. And again, you can see that little blip in the middle where it was high, and that's so where the solar radiance increased or came up. And sorry, let me get this right in my head. Sorry, but we had this like a blimp here. You can see with my cursor of temperatures where it actually dropped a bit as we cleaned up that part of all that particulate, and then it's raced on again. But generally, as a pattern, the solar radiation, like from 360 to 1360 to 1362 watts a square metre globally, there hasn't been a huge difference at all. Now, in tandem with global heating, we're also seeing greatly accelerating transformation of our biosphere. So from a natural symbiotic ecosystem to a human-centred resource pot. If we take our forests away, as we have been, and we then remove a crucial rain-making water pump for our climate system, and we remove this extraordinary carbon store as well as habitat to support over half of all the plant and animal species on the planet. Our forests are very rich in biodiversity. And also with our forests, you know, many of the people in our Zoom, we've been to Germany, and you'll know it's really quite hard to see really natural, biodiverse, multi-species broadleaf and conifer forests in Germany and Switzerland. Mostly they're just sort of conifer-only forests. Really, they're croplands with a few exceptions. Whereas when you move east to Slovenia and then on to places like even into Romania and right into Eastern Europe and into Russia, you'll see those biodiverse forests, those natural forests as they were prior to the manipulation of those into a timber resource or a wood energy or as a pulp and paper resource. The other thing we've done, 10,000 years ago, if you just think of the mass of the vertebrate and land animals on the earth, 99% of that mass was in our wild animals, so our elephants and every other thing, and 1% was in humans. And today, 67% of the vertebrate mass, or the mass of vertebrate land animals, is the livestock that we eat, or get milk from, or wool. Only 1% now is in wild animals, and 32% is in humans. So we've really had this dramatic shift and degradation of our natural earth systems. And of course, you can see how global heating compounds this nature decline. So by desiccating the world's forests and causing them to burn much more frequently and severely and extensively, not only here in Australia, but from the tropics in Brazil and Indonesia, through mid-latitude regions, so Australia and the United States, all the way to the Arctic, Scandinavia, Russia and Canada. Huge forest fires, you wouldn't think in such cold places, but the absolute humidity in those areas is very dry and getting drier. Now, and by the way, in recent years, these unstoppable fires have added 20% to global greenhouse gas emissions. And the increased atmospheric carbon also heats up and it acidifies our ocean waters. And that causes the death of coastal mangroves and coral reefs that serve as crucial fish nurseries and protect against onshore storm erosion. It also forces the decline of giant kelp forests and vast sea meadows. And it turns our oceans from net carbon sinks to net carbon emitters. So This little graphic here that I drew from a webinar presentation from Professor Will Steffen, a climate scientist based in Sydney. He has built this, showing that in the time of JC in the Roman Empire, you could see pretty well from there to about the mid-1800s or just before the 1900s, temperatures varied very, very little. The global temperatures on the planet, the average temperatures sort of really up or down 0.1 of a degree from a median line, maybe a little bit of a drop over that period of 0.2 of a degree. But since the 1900s or the early 1900s, we've soared up to a full 1 degree above that sort of baseline median. And actually, that really should be right up much. This graphic's not quite perfect because it really should be much higher on the page, up to where that little black line finishes. So we're already at 1 degree of global temperature rise from the median. And we've committed ourselves, just because the climate system has an inertia to it. It's a bit like a big rolling ball. We've committed ourselves already by the way we burn fossil fuels and degrade our carbon sequestering natural Earth systems. We're committed to around 1.5 degrees. We can't change that of global heating in the next decades. And then what these scientists like Professor Will Steffen and countless others around the planet, and many in Australia, and it's now it's only troublemakers that will argue it. You get to they're concerned particularly about a point which you get to from around 1.5 degrees and up, where we come to these things called tipping points, where the natural Earth starts to shift into different states, various aspects of the planet's natural biosystems. And beyond that, as we go to 3, 4 and 5 degrees, or as we would if we just went on as we have been in the last 100 years, and particularly in the last decades, there's no question that the Earth system will move to a new state, and that'll severely challenge contemporary civilization, probably causing it to collapse. And when we are only decades away from that unless we move fast. This is it's not a happy thing to talk about. And these tipping points that you saw a reference to on that graph, so what are they? Well, the green ones are the ones, or these blue ones here up the top. So the Arctic ice sheet, the general consensus among scientists is that it has tipped, and it won't be there in decades to come, maybe 20, 30 years. You'll be able to sail clear of Arctic sea ice. So those waters will become absorbent of the sun's rays rather than reflecting them as a white surface. A similar thing's happened down in the West Antarctic ice sheet and is continuing on in East Antarctic basins. We've got already, we know, essentially the scientists are saying our North Australian or Queensland coral reefs they have no future. They're going to die wholesale. There may be a couple of species that survive, but certainly the diversity of species will not continue. We've got the Amazon rainforest. It's being logged in massive ways and cleared, not only for timber, but also mainly for agriculture. And of course, the fires that are put through there, often deliberately, to basically remove the forest and get more arable land, or land that people can then grow cows on. That in itself, because it's such a large rain system, that is desiccating those forests, and the trees and all the plants in them are suffering seriously. When we talk about, people say, gee, we've had these freezing cold winters in New York and in parts of Europe, in Northern Europe, for example. What's happening there, the best I understand it, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but the best I understand it, it's the Atlantic thermohaline circulation and the jet stream that races across in those sort of northern parts of the world, or below the Arctic Circle, but in sort of those northern European and into Russia and Canada, those areas, that jet stream is slowing down now. And instead of racing across, it's sort of wobbling up and down with the seasons. And so it's bringing freezing Arctic air down in the winter sometimes into these northern European and New Yorky places, and causing those horrific cold snaps. Similarly, it wobbles down into the Sahara and brings up to France and Germany and Italy these stinking hot week-long weather events where a lot of people die from just heat exhaustion. Their built environment, it's usually elderly people, but their built environment cannot, it hasn't been designed for those extreme variances that we're now seeing. There's issues with permafrost. So in these boreal forests that I mentioned before are burning, it's the largest terrestrial biome on the planet. Big forests spanning right from Scandinavia through Russia and across over Canada. Those forests are suffering from heat, they're suffering from desertification, and they're suffering a lot from logging for all sorts of, both from China and from Europe. Timber that comes into Australia and dominates our timber industry. I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But when those forests are removed or die, it then exposes the permafrost, which is the frozen ground below, inside of which frozen methane, I'm not sure if it's frozen or if it's in gas form down there, but it then thaws and the methane bubbles up, and the methane has a potency as a greenhouse gas around 25 times that of carbon dioxide. And this is a huge issue, both up in those forests and also under the water, under the sea, in other parts of the world, like you can see on the southwest coast of the USA, and up there on the above Japan, those sorts of areas. So these are all these are tipping point. These are sort of natural Earth systems that the fear is that they either have already or they will either sooner or later tip into a state that is not conducive to a climate that's going to help us to thrive. And the bigger fear is that one collapse will cause another, like a domino effect. So this is really scary stuff. So clearly we have ourselves a climate and biodiversity emergency. And if we ignore it, as we have in the main, we will, within the next 20 years or so, lock ourselves and our children into a future in which Earth's natural systems will topple into a very different state. Now, the planet itself will be irreversibly altered, but it will repair itself to a new state, but not in a way that'll sustain even a fraction of our now 7.7 billion global population, and certainly not in a way that'll be conducive to civilized human society as we've been able to enjoy for the most these past centuries. Now, I appreciate that what I'm presenting here sounds incredibly pessimistic, if not apocalyptic, but we are seeing now the beginning of our Earth systems collapsing in a way that we've been warned of since the 1960s by a chorus of internationally eminent, peer-reviewed climate scientists and ecologists. These are, or at least they were, quietly spoken people who wore knitted vests, and they were employed by our public service. In Australia, they were people like Barry Pettick, Graham Pearman, Will Steffen, who I showed you the graph of, David Lindenmayer, a world-renowned forest ecologist, Tim Flannery, who many of you might know. That's just to name a few. We have great scientists in Australia. So why are our respectable scientists around the world now calling for a 1.5 limit to global warming? So we're already at 1 degree. And the reason is, you can see here on this graph, that the longer we continue with increases in emissions or continue to push our carbon dioxide budget up into the atmosphere, the longer we continue to do that, the more inertia there will be in the climate system and our Earth systems to actually go into this altered state or to shift into a new state. And the further up we go and the longer we take to turn our emissions down, the more sharply we need to then reduce our emissions. So you can see here, if we left it till 2025, which is only 4 years away, one electoral cycle, we need to come to zero emissions or net emissions by 2035. That's what the science is modelling. If we did it earlier in 2016, which we didn't, we'd have a bit more time. So you can, the parallel that, or the kind of analogy that people sometimes use with this is the Titanic. And I say with the Titanic, the faster it is travelling towards the iceberg, the faster it does that, the more sharply and quickly it needs to turn, obviously, to try to miss the iceberg. But you get to a point where the ship just can't turn fast enough and it crashes. So that's what I've heard many scientists use that analogy. So the Titanic's a big ship with a lot of inertia behind it, and it can't just dodge overnight to a new way of sailing to keep its passengers safe. So this climate science is confronting. And this homegrown man on the right has long played a huge role, certainly in Australia and the US, in discrediting the science. So via his Fox Media, Sky News, tabloid newspapers like the Australian, Herald Sun, Daily Telegraph, Courier Mail, and those shock jocks on his payroll like Alan Jones and Andrew Bolt, Rupert Murdoch has confused the science, giving us the social license to ignore it and to keep things as they are. And of course, this is very much in his and his mates' interests. So this first part of my talk to you about the problem of climate change, it's been guided in part by webinars presented by climate scientist Will Steffen, that I mentioned, to various audiences last year during COVID. And you could, the one there you can tune into, because I think this Zoom's being recorded. Michelle, is it? I think. Yep. And so you'll be able to grab that link. Otherwise, just Google a webinar from Will Steffen. I'm sure it'll come up.
It is being recorded.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Michelle, yeah. Now, my wife, Teresa, she teaches in sustainability and health. And she has a deep concern with me presenting problems in ways that may well put fear into others. She sees fear as debilitating and unhelpful. And I do get where she's coming from. And for some people, I think it has that overwhelming effect. But I'd like to reflect here, as so many others have done as well, on last year. When COVID first hit China and then Italy, our wonderful medical scientists around the world were imploring us to take immediate emergency action. And meanwhile, too many punters went to the footy and on a cruise to keep the wheels of commerce turning, as we do. And as it was encouraged by Trump, Johnson, Putin, Bolsonaro, and our own ScoMo. Now that disregard for science, that had me react in fear, as my darling will attest to. We know how COVID panned out in the lands of Trump and Johnson and Putin and Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro being Brazil. And I thank God for the respect for medical science that sits in Australia's state governments. It's the unknown and complacency that makes me fearful. Once I understand what's in front of me, however bad it is, fear compels me to act in ways that take me somewhere more worthwhile than where I was before. And that can be invigorating. And I don't think I'm alone with this. I see it helps in others as well. I see it heaps. And yes, we are at the edge of a frightening tipping point with global heating, nature decline and social inequality. We're in an emergency. But there's no question in my mind that we're also at a social tipping point, and one that's led most passionately by our youth, who, as Greta points out, see us in our generation as stealing our children's future in front of their very eyes. So the moral obligation of our generation and the urgency in this obligation, it's got me consumed, I must say. So what might we do to address our climate emergency? You'll often hear it couched in two, some would say compatible, but I think also competing paradigms. So one is that we mitigate climate change, another being that we adapt to climate change. And I can see in political discourse at the moment, particularly in Australia, there is a lot of emphasis on adapting to climate change. Now, on mitigation, it's generally considered that the simplest and most effective way to mitigate or to slow down climate change, that's to decarbonise our economy. So essentially that's to stop our use of fossil fuels, so coal, gas, oil, and then to transition rapidly to renewable energy for our built environment, for our industry and for our transport modes. We've started on this readily achievable path, albeit at a snail's pace in the context of the scale and urgency of the task before us. Now, another impactful way is to reduce our consumption of red meat and biofuels that drive the destruction of so many of our intact natural forests. And we've also begun adapting to climate change. So we're fitting buildings with way more air conditioners than ever before, although the mainly coal-fired manufacture and operation of these appliances via coal-fired electricity, that emits more CO2 than other far more impacting refrigerant gases into the atmosphere. And then by thinning and clearing our forests, including in and around bushfire-prone settlements, as it's proposed here in an architectural mag, no less, that's also proposed for adapting to climate change, when that itself exacerbates our emergency because it further degrades natural ecosystems, services that are operating there, so rainmaking, atmospheric carbon sequestration, animal habitat, etc. And then there's lots of talk about building concrete seawalls to protect our coastal environments. I remember pictures of just in Sydney, around the Sydney coast there not long ago. So doing that for more and more energetic ocean storms, when just the cement in concrete is responsible for 8% of our planet's greenhouse gas emissions. It's staggering, and I'll talk just a little bit more about that soon. So whilst climate change adaptation is an inevitable necessity, it's not the panacea that those subscribing to business as usual futures would like it to be. So what can we do to really effectively and fearlessly tackle this climate and biodiversity emergency? I reckon we need to learn to re-love the earth, and to do that by harnessing personal responsibility, collective action and good governance. Now, what might that look like? In a nutshell, I reckon it's about consuming less stuff, thinking globally and acting locally, that's the old adage, and also doing things together, because that empowers and it infirms us when things get tough. And also we need to be brave and we need to be vocal. I'll try now to explain myself a bit better by reflecting on a few things I've dabbled in over the years in effort to address climate change and nature decline and social inequality, with a small local systems approach to architecture and to farming. And I'm sure you'll see how this approach will translate to your own fields of pursuit. How you can, or how you may already be taking similar steps yourselves. In my uni studies, back in the 1970s, I was introduced to the notion of architecture, not only as a noun, like as a physical thing or a product, but also as a verb, a doing thing, a process. So architecture can build community as it makes place. And that then shifts the gaze of an architect away from project delivery at a professional distance and towards immersion in a creative process that's accessible to all and as an essential cultural act. So inspired by that perspective, I spent a lot of the first 10 years of my career living and working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in rural and remote parts of Australia. These communities had very little opportunity to provide for their own shelter needs. The government agencies, they delivered housing to those communities, which by design was unsuited to the local climate and traditional lifestyles, and which adopted expensive and specialised construction methods that discouraged local labour input. Some of these communities invited me to guide them to design their own homes in ways that were meaningful to them via hands-on, non-precious model-making workshops and lots of discussion. And to build their own homes using materials that were freely available in the local bush, including stone, earth, and crushed anthill, bamboo, as well as raw pole and chainsaw mill timbers. And also to help them to adopt simple construction methods that were suited to the community workforce. And they were men, women, and children who all had very different levels of health and strength and skill. So we were able to re-establish a self-help housing culture at Mount Cat, that's a very small outstation in South Central Arnhem Land, on Moa Island in the Torres Straits, and on Palm Island in North Queensland. So this self-help housing approach, it did show good results on the ground, and it became popular as a pathway to skill development and home ownership. It also provided a creative social pursuit to socialise around, and it built a collective pride. And that then also gave communities courage to start again with other small local enterprises. So things like commercial fishing, market gardening, bread baking, and forestry, for example. I still think today that building homes and community in this way, this very local way, it's a key to a more resilient future, especially in these uncertain times. And I reckon we will always remain in awe of creativity that's born of hardship. This is actually in somewhere very different, in Chile, some work that was done reconstructing part of Valparaiso after a bushfire burned its way into the city. It's awesome, awesome work. One of my life's joys that also absolutely informs my architectural work is planting trees. So lots on a little place we have in South Gippsland that was essentially a bare paddock when we bought it in 1988. And between 1989 and 2004, a further 400,000 trees up and down our valley with local farmers and friends. And we were Victoria's first farm tree group. And as you know, as Templars, these actions also bind us in local community. Now, less than 20 years on, the valley looks like this. And then there's our little mixed orchard, where we produce feijoas and citrus and many other fruits. And they're things we eat and share with our friends and we sell commercially, including to Ceres Market and to its online grocer, Ceres Fair Food. And these things sustain us. I'm one of an ever-increasing number of tiny primary producers who can't sell to the Epping market. Sorry, in Melbourne, that's the big organic wholesale market, and also where all the other fruit and veg goes on its way to the retail outlets. And we can't sell to Coles or to Woolies. We're way too small. We couldn't even begin to compete on price with the corporate food giants who normally supply these mainstream wholesalers and retailers, invariably with lots of environmental inputs and impacts. But we can pick our produce and we can have it delivered super fresh and yummy to the kitchens of our customers within 24 hours. We do that with the help of Fair Food, which is a Ceres social enterprise that employs refugees and other new Australians to sell and distribute chemical-free fruit and veg via an efficient online ordering system. So Fair Food is exactly that. It pays us well for our produce, however little it is. Yesterday, I think I delivered, I don't know, only about 50 kilos altogether, just some apples and limes last night to Fair Food. It doesn't matter how little amounts. Fair Food employs mainly new refugees who really need work, and it keeps things affordable for its customers. Now, a number of you joining in this Zoom, I know you fondly remember my dear cousin and fellow Templar, Roland Lashinsky. Well, about 5 years back, his son, Jonathan, the middle one, he's all grown up now, and aptly, appropriately, that's him there on my cursor as a little fella when he came to plant trees with us, actually in that area where that little movie ran. He's aptly got the word peach on his T-shirt. Anyway, he and his partner, Jess, were encouraged by Ceres Fair Food in setting up their own organic green grocery down at Edith Vale in Bayside, Melbourne. And that's Jono and Jess just up there on the right-hand side. It began as a truly micro-scale enterprise and quickly came to flourish. Now, Jono and Jess source almost all their fruit and veg from within 100 kilometres, not from overseas or the other side of Australia. And they supply to homes within around 4 kilometres of their little shop. And rather than expanding their business and their geographic reach, as they've explained to me, they'd rather encourage other young people to set up similar green groceries down the road. And they together then share the logistic of farm pickups. That saves on fuel, time and money, and it increases profits. And it's better for the environment. These days, Edie Grocer holds regular evenings at the nearby Bowls Club, where its farmers and customers meet to share yummy homemade meals. They host passata making workshops and all sorts of other fun events. It's just fantastic. Jono and Jess are now also supporting young farmers who are landless, but they're able to rent for a song a couple of idle acres just out of town from old blokes like me. These energetic young'uns can make a respectable income growing fabulous fresh fruit and veg on what are quite small plots. And they do that on order for Edie Grocer. So minimal capital input, lots of healthy labour, old guard farmers enjoying some youthful company, everybody wins. Small, local, community-based enterprises like this, they can be replicated many times over to serve cities and nations. And they can do that without the devastating environmental footprint, social injustice, and the opacity that's attached to global supply chains. These little enterprises, they help to create the ties that bind us for a resilient future. And it's a future in which local is really going to matter. between 2002 and 2019, I was heavily engaged with Mullum Creek, which is a peri-urban eco-housing project in Don Vale, Victoria. My task there was to draw positive environmental outcomes from the project that go well beyond and address weaknesses in what was generally considered to be the best practice sustainable development at the time. Now, I learned a bunch of things around this job. Firstly, I learned that in the last 40 years, the living space that the average Australian inhabits has increased by 240%. And this has then increased the material energy resources we think we require to live in our homes by nearly the same 240%. It's staggering. And how do we compare on this with other countries? Well, we're the top performers, or I'm being sarcastic. We even beat the United States. Compare the UK and China. So this is the floor space per capita that we inhabit in our homes. The same supersize it trend now also applies to office and retail buildings. So we live in an age of enlightened greed. Now, per square metre of floor area, it's fair to say that the operational energy and the water efficiency of new housing in Australia, so the things that make them run, that is slowly improving per square metre. What this means, though, is that the materials that are used to construct buildings, particularly as they get bigger and bigger, our homes, it remains, these materials remain as the primary driver to the overall life cycle environmental impact of a home. So building services and appliances that are attached to the operation of homes, they can be upgraded to embrace new technologies and to provide improved energy and water efficiencies through what needs to be a long service life in a home. But our specification of concrete, steel, bricks, wood, it's got much more, they have much more serious impacts, and they're almost immediate and for the most part locked in, less so for us, but more so for our future generations to face by way of resource depletion, biodiversity loss and climate change. So you can see here, like we put a lot of emphasis on space heating and cooling, so that, you know, the thermal performance of homes, which is important, don't get me wrong there. And we know as a mandated minimum for Australia, it's 6-star energy rating. If you increase it to 7.5 star, you almost halve the space heating and cooling requirement in a home. But you can see that the overall life cycle environmental impact of a home is only marginally reduced. If you add solar power, that's like a negative, if you like, that's a, you know, it's working to counteract the operational impacts of running a home. That can have some really decent impacts. The 4 kilowatt solar system, very worth doing, very much worth doing. But you can see that the construction of a home, the initial construction and the repairs and maintenance, they're still very, very dominant in a 6 and then 7.5 star home in our climate. In our this is for Melbourne climate, even more the case in Sydney. So if you believe the science as it's presented to us, what matters most now is how deeply and quickly we arrest CO2 emissions and biodiversity collapse. If we don't move mountains in the next 5 to 10 years, we're in trouble. So if you have a new home in mind, be mindful that its overall environmental impact across those next 10 years, those emergency years, this period, like we've never faced before, it will be tied almost entirely to its construction. Now, the World Green Building Council has for some time now put buildings as responsible for 39% of global CO2 emissions. So on that figure, we have an acute and urgent responsibility to future generations to design buildings that are going to be flexible, and they need to be modest in scale. At Mullum Creek, I can't say that we succeeded in this regard at all. Some of the homes there are of monstrous size. I wasn't able to convince the estate developers that we could market a vision of environmental quality that appeals despite and because of strict limits to quantity. Wherever I can, I do desperately try to encourage my clients, whether it's for homes or other buildings, to build small and to appreciate much of what they already have, to explain why, to delicately rework existing buildings where they can, to apply our finest collective design skills to minimise natural resource depletion and to give our planet a chance to heal. To accept that a gentle architectural touch may not catch the eye of today's glossy magazines, but to know that future life on Earth will thank us for it. Despite these serious shortcomings with building scale at Mullen Creek, we did manage to apply both carrots and sticks to drive very high thermal performance for homes on the estate, as well as the uptake of rooftop PVs, water conservation, environmentally friendly building materials, a high level of construction waste recycling, and site-sensitive landscape design. We also publish swags of practical guides and info sheets to support the implementation of these initiatives. Now, they're now circulating widely, also beyond the estate, because it's free knowledge for the commons and they're being updated regularly. You can find all these guides and things about home building on the project website at mullencreek.com.au. My team and the philanthropic developers for the project, we were all impressed with how cooperatively and effectively almost all building and landscape contractors embraced Mullen Creek's many what were at the time landmark environmental initiatives. So deep and sudden change is possible. I'll just quickly fly you past, just say, two materials that are very common and very environmentally impacting that are just ubiquitous through the built environment. Portland cement manufacture, which is cement that goes into most concrete and into mortar, it's responsible for a whopping 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, like I mentioned earlier. In concrete, mortar and rammed earth walling, it can, for the most, be substituted with other equally performing cementitious materials, or SCMs, such as slag, which is a waste from steel smelting, and fly ash, which is a waste from coal burning, but it's not being picked up anywhere near fast enough in industry. So these alternatives for wet mix concrete, as well as for bagged cement, are now readily available at most batching plants and hardware stores, and certainly across our major cities. So if you're ever doing anything with cement or concrete, it's a no-cost, no-brainer. Be a leader and replace at least part of your Portland cement with SCMs. And if you refer to the Mullen Creek Concrete and Cement Products guides, it'll be a complete cinch for you. Okay, timber is another quick one, always your past. Even before our horrific Australian bushfires started in September in 2019, deforestation was responsible for some 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The vast bulk of structural, architectural and furniture timbers we use are sourced in ways that contribute directly and indirectly to this forest demise. Whether it's from Southeast Asian rainforest for our Merbau decking, or from the Amazon for our Kumaru cladding and decking, whether it's from the Russian or East European taiga or the boreal forests for our Baltic pine, structural framing, IKEA furniture, or if it's from Australia for our eucalypt beams and window frames. Logging of native forests, it drives biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. It also encourages pest, weed and exposure-related dieback, and that then obviously exacerbates wildfire risk. And these risks are, as I mentioned before, they're compounded now by a hotter and drier climate. So please make sure, and do something good of our recent bushfire tragedy. Ensure that you don't source timber from intact and regenerating natural forests, but rather from trees that are purposefully planted on previously cleared farmland or recycled from prior constructions, and that timber makes its way into your homes. It leaves many good timber choices that you can be steered to via these guides on the Mullen Creek website. That then also sends a strong message to the now global timber industry that will entertain only fairly sourced wood. Just as a simple note on that, over the past 6 years or so, our big chain trade and retail timber yards have, in on and off waves, they've shifted their supply of softwood framing timber, your normal sort of pine to make a wall frame, away from fast-grown radiata pine, which is from temperate climate Australia or New Zealand plantations, and they've transitioned towards slow-grown Baltic pine and spruce. Much of it is from cold climate native conifer and broadleaf forests of Russia and the Baltic states. At your local Bunnings store, you'll see Baltic pine and radiata pine stocked and sold as the very same framing wood, so MGP10 or MGP12 pine. There's no indication anywhere in the yard or on the wood as to the country of origin. Same price. But take a quick squiz at the end grain and it'll tell you the story. Each growth ring represents a year in the life of a tree, which I'm sure you know. The 90 by 35 rift-sawn sticks of Baltic pine on the bottom right of the screen, they show an average 90 years of growth just in that bit of wood. That's really slow. If we judge the curvature of these growth rings, I would say this wood has been milled from a log that grew to maybe 250 to 300 millimetres diameter in around 90 to 120 years at best. The yield of millable wood from a log of this small diameter would be miserable. The same size rift-sawn sticks of radiata pine on the top left of your screen, they were grown and milled within a few hours' drive of Melbourne, so in Western Victoria. They show an average 9 years of growth, and that's fast. This wood, that's been milled from a log that grew to maybe 450 to 500 millimetre diameter in around 25 to 30 years. So if you're shopping at Bunnings, please go for the local radiata pine, and this is the way you can tell. It's the only way you'll be able to tell what it is you're getting off the racks. I love working with wood, and I love seeing how well local fast-grown plantation timbers, how they can perform. Structurally also, replacing steel, which in turn is responsible, that steel, for another whopping 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, same as concrete. These are huge contributors to the problem we have. Here it's an earth-covered library and wildfire shelter for a small independent school in country Victoria, close to a forest. It's got a lot of half a metre of soil over the top of it. In converting 6 little log cabins into classrooms for that same school, I was also keen to get the students engaged in both design and construction processes, and that was fun. The Australian building industry now relies on truly global timber supply chains, in which environmental and social standards underlying forest management, they are for the most very poor. The resultant impacts on our climate and biodiversity are devastating. Yet in the name of progress and lifestyle, we resign ourselves to global heating, mid-latitude desertification, and the ever-increasing rate at which our forests are burnt and cleared. And we do that at the peril of our existence. So it's refreshing now to see also small farmers who are located within a stone's throw of Melbourne beginning to harvest fast-grown native and exotic trees, which they planted in the 80s and the early 90s for conservation and for profit. They've form pruned, thinned and high pruned these trees to produce high quality architectural timber. And they've done this on often steep, previously cleared and degraded land that had limited agricultural value. Over the past 5 years, pretty well everyone I've had working with me in my office has volunteered to team up with Ceres. So that's the Centre for Education and Research in Environmental Strategies, and it's in East Melbourne.
Ceres.
With Ceres, we've been able to extend the timber initiative from Mullen Creek into the launch of a new social enterprise, Ceres Fair Wood. The profits from Ceres Fair Wood, they all go back into Ceres Community Environment Park. Fairwood removes itself from the adversarial native forest debate and the opaque environmental certification schemes around. And it buys only from growers and millers who source wood to the highest standards of environmental and social responsibility. That was, as was informed by the Mullen Creek project. Fairwood shares these growers and these millers' stories directly with its customers. So building and landscape contractors, furniture makers and DIYers. I think Thomas has, down near Wilson's Prom, has got a deck made of plantation sugar gum that came from Ceres Fairwood, and good on Thomas, and Caroline, sorry, but Thomas was who was chatting to me on the phone about it a while back. So Fairwood business builds direct friendships and understandings between city and country folk, and it encourages farming families to revegetate their bare paddocks with trees for conservation and profit. Okay, now, as Michelle mentioned earlier, I'm ever mindful of how centrally my heritage and upbringing in the Australian Templar community have informed my approach as an architect and a small farmer. These community-based building projects on our screen, which we all know, in Palestine and in Australia, they come with a story of migration that's defined by cultural, familial and religious ties. And I reckon they were founded more on a strong sense of collective purpose and good work than on material or financial resource. Can this story and our extraordinary Templar legacy, can it nourish us to enrich the future? Could it advance or even redefine our future core purposes in the Temple Society? As the Temple Society now wanes in membership and participation, we meet to discuss ways of drawing lapsed Templars back into our fold and inviting others to join in on our traditional activities that take place mostly in our space. So the things we do and have enjoyed in Australia for over 70 years. I know I've banged on about this before to some of you, but I'd like to suggest that we now draw on our good fortune and our hearts, informed by our extraordinary Templar heritage, to more actively and energetically reach out to those who struggle in the broader community, as well as to our suffering natural world. In this further uncertain time, in this climate and biodiversity emergency, there's more work, good work to be done, and we need to do it together. I think we're so well placed to demonstrate our values through more extensive and palpable action in social and environmental outreach beyond our Templar community. Put simply, more champions. Good work of this kind, it brings people together around a common altruistic objective, and it drives an infectious sense of belonging. In my mind, this is how we can best strengthen our Templar way. God knows, and we know deep in our hearts, that our climate and biodiversity emergency, poverty, gender inequality, refugee and Indigenous disadvantage, cross-generational inequity, nuclear arms, civil and cross-national conflict. These are problems of the world. The address of these are undeniable moral imperatives. And yet these issues involve policy, and that engages politics. But this must not make them no-go zones for the TSA. I relish the plural perspectives of our elders, whichever way they lean, when they reflect on these issues at our religious services, rather than hearing the same old dogma served up in churches elsewhere. Similarly, I'm in awe of individual Templars who, in their lives outside our community, address these problems of the world with deep commitment and powerful results. I'd really love to see us jog up alongside these inspiring Templars to offer our formal and active support as an organisation. We're in a different time now to those pioneering days when Templars were all over a planet that seemed boundless and eternally robust. We're entering an era of significant hardship as our resource-hungry lifestyles and our planet's limits begin to collide. In times like these, I reckon it's the glue in the middle between individuals and nations. So broad social and environmental outreach that I think will bring us all together and make things right. And with our precious heritage, the Templar community is so well placed to be that glue. Bayswater's Community Garden, it's a wonderful project in itself because it brings people together around a common, creative and nature-based pursuit. And even during last year's long COVID lockdown, with Christine's help, Christine Coxell, we were able to connect via Zoom and share tips to make our home gardens more bountiful and to keep us cheery. I'm in admiration of the commitment made recently by the TSA's elders to act on broader environmental and social justice issues, and the statement that they've penned to formalise this. Last Thursday, the 11th of March, was a global multi-faith day of climate action, and it was auspiced by the ARRCC, which is the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, as well as Green Faith Australia. The bells of our Templar Chapel rang at 11 a.m. on that day to raise the alarm in concern for our sacred people and our sacred earth. And the next evening, last Friday, a small group of our Templar youth, they met to begin discussion on good environmental and social actions that they could take in the broader community. And these young ones, they were inspiring. Great ideas were flagged. Things from one end, tree planting on our bare country hills, right up to the idea of social housing for the poor on parts of the Bayswater land that rarely gets used. And establishing a local good karma network, it also really rang a chord amongst them. I hadn't really heard of that much at all. So that's a network that'd have Templars connecting with the broader community to better share the stuff we've accumulated personally over the years, and to give and to receive help without hesitation. And that is, I think, definitely enough from me. I hope we can now hook into lots of terrific questions from you and hope we can have some awesome discussion on this rather overwhelming topic. I'm sorry that I've taken a long time to finish, and thank you heaps, Michelle, because you've for inviting me to present at this Sydney Speaker Series. Good on you, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks. That was a great presentation. I have to admit, I'm gobsmacked by some of the slides that you presented. I'm not sure about everybody else, but I've learned a lot. Some of the things I actually sort of thought I knew, I obviously didn't know enough. So we're going to open it up to questions. A lot of you have got your cameras turned off, so if you'd like to ask a question, if you want to turn your camera on, and we can discuss anything that has been spoken about today or this evening.
Anything come up in the chats, Michelle? Oh, no,
no, not yet. No.
I'll have a go, Paul.
Oh, good on you, Fred.
Last year taught us a lot about all of a sudden giving full voice to our eminent scientists who, I guess, led the way. Yeah. Led the way out of COVID, and our mainly state governments who had the balls to stand up to, if we don't get the health right, we don't get an economy. That's sort of got the last 40 years of climate science distilled down into a 12-month. We trust the science. We listen to the scientists, except for where it's not politically acceptable. I think a lot of what you've presented, I guess, focused largely, I guess, on what we as individuals can do, but what can we do to mobilise people together to send an indelible message, I guess, to our politicians, the ones that can actually turn on and off the lights. What can we do to actually get them to listen and stop saying, oh, it's the jobs, it's the jobs, it's the jobs, it's the jobs.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, it's like an echo chamber, and it's not going to change until something in the population forces them to change. Any suggestions other than anarchy?
Yeah. Oh, look, Fred, it's the best question in the world that you've asked, you know. And, you know, COVID was really, in a way, I mean, as terrible as it was exactly like you said, it was a bit of a practice. And it was a one-issue thing, because exactly as you said, if we don't have our health, we don't have an economy. And equally, if we don't have a benign and healthy and supportive environment, you know, one that can help us to thrive, we don't have health and we don't have an economy. And the other thing is COVID, I'm confident that it's come and it will end, it will finish, and we'll move on. And hopefully next time when there's a pandemic of this kind, we'll be much quicker and smarter about our approach, you know, and our priorities. I think that's the thing. Climate change is a much more difficult one because it rolls along like a snowball. It gathers snow, it gathers momentum like the Titanic. And unfortunately, this is where the scientists are so frightened, is that, and you know, and they have been telling us, but it's comfortable to try to ignore it, is that we could come to these tipping points. That's what the most problematic thing. We can come to those, and it may, at that time, we may still be reasonably comfortable with our weather day to day, but the tipping points are going to drive us over the edge, regardless of what we do. The natural earth will then take control over us as a civilization, as a species. So the only way, I agree with you entirely, the only way to deal with that is to start, well, first of all, to discuss things like we are tonight, to talk about that broadly, to then, you know, join back in physical marches. I know we do a lot with, you know, what do you call it, petitions online that we send to our prime ministers and others. We need Australia in particular, because the government is not listening anywhere near enough, particularly our current government, our national government. We need to march and rally and be loud and brave. And when you do that in huge numbers, and I think we are at that tipping point. In some ways, it's a social tipping point. In some ways, COVID got in the way, but I reckon very quickly now we will, as we get more of these fires, more other kind of really horrific issues, we will mobilise, and things will change quickly. Fossil fuel, moving to a decarbonised economy, is actually, you'll hear all sorts of tripe from government and interest groups as to why we need baseload power that you can't provide from renewables. I could bore you with the science. I could bore you with the technology, but I won't. But a really good read is from Ross Garnaut, who is one of our, you might know Fred, yeah, he's one of our, he was, you know, I think Australia's chief economist for a while. He writes about this stuff and consults all the scientists and presents all the ways in which we can provide baseload power to completely avoid coal and bioenergy, which has also got other problems. We can very quickly transition to a renewable energy future that's basically electrified. And that will make a huge immediate difference. We can do that in 10 years. And the climate scientists and the technologists say we can do it, and we just have to do it. And we've got to start yesterday. So that, I think it's just mobilising, being loud, being vocal, putting PVs on your roof yourself. You know, I know a lot of Templars have done that. It's a no-brainer. It's a bit like the cement in the concrete. You could be a poor person, have no monetary financial reserves, go to the bank, borrow with a personal loan money to put in a good quality solar system, and it will, the money you will save from the power you don't have to draw from the coal grid, and the money that you'll get paid or don't have to pay from exporting power to the grid, that'll completely offset any interest rates on the investment of the solar. So yeah, but just mobilising, being loud, being vocal, and doing it en masse. That's my suggestion, and doing it tomorrow. And that, you know, if Templars, like, you know, church communities, I think, you know, we have sort of a license, if you like, to really, people notice when, you know, faith communities, because they're not doing it for personal gain, when they gather together and march, you know, march with all our friends as well, but say, hey, look, we're Templars, and we formally, you know, are really worried about our climate and social inequality and all that stuff. And that's exactly what the elders have now signed a commitment to kind of move forward on that. And it's awesome. I'm in awe and in admiration. Well, thanks, Fred.
And for those who are a bit shy and don't want to actually speak, if you want to pop your questions into the chat, which the function's down the bottom of your screen, I'm happy to ask them on your behalf.
So Paul,
Yes.
last Friday's session with the young guys, what was the action items, if you like? Is there anything out of there that us old farts can get behind the young people?
Well, I reckon, I think the trick would be to have I think they get meeting again. I think there's even talk about them catching up at Sommerfest and bringing in other people from the community as well, and maybe even other people from the local area to chat about this stuff, which is really nice. I'm not sure how that was flagged. Jess was there. Oh, here we go. No, Jess can answer the question. Sorry, not for me.
Yeah, she's waving, yes.
Sorry, I thought I might help you out on this one, Paul. So I've actually taken a fair amount of notes. I was there sort of representing the elders, I suppose, and more in listening what they had to say rather than trying to encourage or create ideas, because ideally we want them to come up with that. So what they're trying to get, their picture, I think, is a bit bigger than climate change. They want to sort of tackle all social and environmental justice issues, which does become hard, of course, because there are so many. But I think the first step that they'd really like to do is jump on board this good karma. And basically that's just creating sort of like a Facebook page to start with across social media platforms, and basically encourages people to interact with each other and more so actually help out with each other. So whether or not it's something that you might not need in your house that somebody else could utilize, whether it's a service that you can provide, or even if you're a person, for instance, that's in need and wanting support, having that as a level of support to come together and then move forward in that is, I think, something that they want to start with, because it is a bit daunting, you know, it's like, where do you start? So I think they're starting with something small like that. As far as I understand, and obviously this needs to sort of go a bit further with Kath, I think we're trying to look at getting monthly conversations happening. It could be just catching up, and they might be conversations about nothing. It could be that, you know, they're just chatting about any other issues that are coming up, whether or not they sort of go along to any marches or anything that comes up. They're just trying to start somewhere and going from there. So ultimately, as a community, we sort of want to try and stand behind them, because yeah, without sounding too cliche, they're our future, I suppose. And just real quick, I am actually going to put it out there. I actually put my name down for when we were organising the bell ringing last week with the ARRCC, and I've been receiving emails from them. One of them I actually got today. Basically, they're asking for another call for action. So it's sort of incorporating all of the communities around the world that joined, and there were over 420 actions around the world in a total of 49 countries. We had 136 across Australia, and they're basically putting together a Zoom session on Thursday, March the 25th, between 6 to 7 p.m. for anybody else who's sort of interested in taking the next step. So I've literally just received the email today, but I think if anyone is actually interested, I'm happy to put it up in the chat. I might speak to Ange about actually putting it out into the online bulletin, because I'll be attending, simply because, you know, now that we've sort of registered with them, I think it's really good that we continue our involvement, but also putting it out to anybody else, anyone who's keen, anyone who sort of wants to jump on board, anyone who just wants to sit there and listen, or even to sort of get an idea of what they're talking about, to maybe a better understanding of what, you know, what we can do.
Jess, if you want to put that up, I can actually forward it to everybody on this call, because I have everyone's email, so I can actually forward it to everybody. No, I think that's great. It's a great initiative. So I hope everyone can support it. I think Alfred was raising his hand prior, so you're on mute. Do you want me to unmute you? Oops, where's my mouse?
Thanks a lot, Paul, for sharing all those insights, and in particular the experience you've had with designing and creating landscapes and buildings, which probably 40 years ago, when we were at university, I was involved with a project called the Autonomous House at Sydney University, and we thought then that, you know, the year after, everyone would have a solar panel and everyone would have solar designed housing and be using those appropriate materials. So I guess we realise, you know, time, that 1 year has taken 40 years, but it's very heartening to see that there are a lot of directional changes in the professions, also community awareness of the issues, and increasing, I suppose, pressure building from that awareness of the broader issues which have raised. So I think in broad terms, it's really fantastic that you've brought that together in one presentation. It's something that'll be of use to a whole lot of people apart from our little group here. In the context of the Temple Society as a whole, I mean, I agree with you that the parallels of environmental and social issues are interrelated with community action. Increasingly, of course, our little community in Sydney is pretty tiny, and I suppose we relate to so many other people in our professional and social lives that we have to integrate those thoughts into those parts of the community rather than just depending on our own internal network. But I agree with you that is a fantastic basis from which to operate, and that the history of the society is an inspiring and uplifting thing. So thanks again.
Oh, thank you, Alfred. And yeah, really nice. I'm not really meeting you, but you know what I mean. It's really nice to meet you for the first time, because we've had a number of SMSs and other sort of things. But what do you call that thing? WhatsApps. But I haven't seen you as live as this before. So it's a delight. Thank you.
Theo, did you have a question as well? Or?
Well, it's not so much a question as a statement, and I've got to preface it by saying that I am increasingly frustrated at the disconnect between our leaders and our economy in terms of what's happening with this, with the exception of what I perceive to be very few parts of industry, such as mining and others. Large industries, for example, my old employer, Coca-Cola, we put solar, I think it was 200 square metres of solar onto our DC in Eastern Creek back in 2009. So businesses are moving this forward And yet the leaders, the people who call themselves the governing bodies, and it doesn't matter which party that is, but there's one in particular, as Paul related to, they willfully ignore what's happening. They willfully ignore the science, and they willfully will not do something about it because they think that they can just chug along. I just look at the current very, very positive action, the Women's March for Change that we had just 2 days ago. And I'm so scared that they're just going to weather it. They're just going to ignore it and ignore it and ignore it and ignore it like they do everything else, and just make sure that it dies. And I think, as Paul said, we do need to get up and we do need to do things about what we think is important to us. That's really all that I wanted to say. But I just feel that somehow, and you know, there were many times, and it was only because of COVID that I didn't, but I was happy to join the kids when they had their strikes, strike for climate. And if they have it again, which I believe there's another one coming up, I will be there because I have the flexibility in my workplace to be able to do that. And I'm just saying the same as what Paul said, encourage everyone, just get up and do it. It doesn't change unless you do it. And it doesn't change unless you write to your MPs, your local people, and say, this is just not acceptable anymore. We need you to take action for the good of ourselves and our future generations. And I mean, I'm looking at my kids and they're blaming us for a lot of the ails that are happening in the world. I think quite rightly, but individually, I think we're all trying to do something to make it better. And like we've had solar for years. I've got bore water down in the peninsula. I don't use tap water. You know, I've got rainwater tanks everywhere. Those sort of things that try to make it go. Heidi has got a sensational organic garden just next door here, where it supplies us for the whole of summer and all the fruit and veg that comes out of there. And those little steps are, I think, positive things that all of us can do to make it move forward. So I'll shut up now.
No, fully agree with you. You know, and Theo, I heard the other day, and I don't know why I didn't think of this. I was down in the country, but I would, even if I was in town, I wouldn't have thought to go to that women's march. Apparently, there were very, very few men there. It's actually incumbent on us as men,
yes,
to support women, because what they were marching about was a men's problem as much as it was a women's problem. You know,
absolutely, yeah.
And when someone, one of my workmates said, you know, she went and she marched. I just thought, oh my gosh, you know. So and if the Temple Society, like if we can pick up on things like that and say, hey, you know, it's really important for Temple men to go along to this march, and we'll do it together. You know, maybe it'll give us more courage to go. And if we're to there, not just Temples, but as a total community, if we're there in the hundreds of thousands, literally, you know, like we were in the in the Iraq War thing, the first Iraq War, Iran-Iraq War, or like we were in the Vietnam War days, and even more, you know, like double it and triple it. They have to start taking notice. You know, it's not just about voting, because unfortunately that's a 4-year, what do you call it, turnaround.
Yes.
And we don't have that time. And then the next step is social disobedience. You know what do you call that? That's the next step along. But I would have hoped we could start with just absolutely do stuff on mass. And when we collect with our friends, or you know, our church communities, or whoever it might be, it just makes the whole thing, I think, more fun, and we feel more supported. You know, we don't feel we're pushing out on a limb or anything like that. It's terrific.
But I think even as individuals, it doesn't need us going as a gang. I think just, you know, pick something that you want to support and just support it as far as you can.
Yes. Unfortunately, the silent, you know, singular people, unfortunately, I think our politicians can happily ignore that ad nauseum. It's not until there's enough of a groundswell, and it doesn't have to be civil disobedience. It can be civil obedience, if you like. It's just a show of strength and common purpose, and eventually they have to listen. They have to listen. You know, they got rid of the wall. There are things that have been moved by just a slow building wave of, just the general population just rising up in obedience, if you like, but eventually the voice will be heard.
Yeah.
Just have to, and it's really, I don't know, there is strength in numbers. It is better if you can get together.
And there's strength in groups too, Fred. Strength in groups because there's this thing about dividing and conquering. That's if you can keep people separate, you've got a much better chance of conquering. And really interesting to look at marches and rallies in places like Berlin, and to see how the people who are protesting, how they organise, and how the police under the government's command, how they actually thwart them. It's so sophisticated, both sides. It's really crazy. But I remember going to that Iran-Iraq war march. I reckon it was before our boys were born. So I can't remember. So let's say it was in the year 2000, something like that. But it was funny. There were all these people marching, like there were church groups, United Church, other kind of groups, Quakers. There were all sorts of other interest groups marching under a banner. And I saw a whole bunch of Templars who were just quietly, standing behind a column. I could tell you, and often they were lapsed Templars, Fred. You know what I mean by that. Ones we got confirmed with, that we never seen since. But I reckon there's something in us saying, hey, this is our history, this is our legacy, our heritage. Let's get together and speak as a block, and I don't know, that's just my theory on it.
I think we have Andrew who would like to say something.
Awesome.
Yeah, sure. I think just picking up, I've agreed with the conversation that's gone on, but one thing I guess let's remind everyone is that politicians are meant to be servants to the people. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to use the connected networks we have to grow people's thinking, because I think one of the downsides we suffer is that once battle lines are drawn and people take up positions on one or other side, it's very, very difficult to shift them off that battle line. And so it is much better if we all, maybe it's like swatting a fly a day. Maybe it's in a subtle way, everyone who understands this situation, and I suspect we wouldn't be on this call if we didn't, takes it upon ourselves to convince one person a day, if we can, who we know, to change the way they think. Because ultimately, if we do that, the politicians take notice. They are servants to us, not us to them. And it is because there's not enough people who think in the way we obviously all think that politicians can get away with what they do. You've got to ultimately bring it from the ground up. That's the only way where these things ever change. And so, networks like this have to grow and develop to really start to make sure that the politicians take notice.
That's a brilliant point, because I agree with that, because there's a lot of complacency around this issue. It's like, well, I can't do anything, and we can't leave it to our children and our future generations, because I think it was 4 years to the tipping point, or 4 years, 2025. So we haven't got that time.
No.
So I think that's a brilliant point.
Very good. Yeah.
Sorry, Paul, you were going to say something?
Oh, no, just couldn't agree more.
Susie's saying something. Susie, unmute yourself.
Susie?
Maybe you should unmute her, Michelle. Oh, no.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, you don't want to?
We got the young generation joining them.
I'm sorry. I'm furiously writing it down because I was trying to get the words right in my head about what I wanted to say, but
And she's muttering
really
to
slow.
herself, and that's what you picked up on.
Just
So
say it
now that you've got the floor, why don't you just say it?
I was just going to comment, which is basically what everybody else has been saying anyway, or add my voice to, I suppose. Firstly, thanks, Paul, for a really great presentation. But I find, I'm going to read what I've started to write because I didn't know how to say it. I think it's quite overwhelming and arresting to individually make a noise or stand against such a large wall of ignorant power for example, the Murdochs of the world, that I think it often renders small individuals quite impotent in action. However, I was going to go on to say that if there's a community or like-minded people or others who encourage to do something, even if it's a small action, that makes a really big difference. So I think this is really great. And, you know, the voice that what Jess was talking about, the young people getting together, their voice will be louder, and individuals will have the courage to stand up and add their voice to something and maybe be heard and make a change. But I find, and I think that probably stops a lot of people from doing things like, you know, writing to their local MP or taking some kind of a stand or action, because of that overwhelming, well, what's my little thing going to be in the face of all of this that's going to stop me from even being heard? So I think that was probably very much what everybody else has been saying as well.
What's that marvelous little saying? A flood starts with one raindrop.
Yeah.
Yep. Good one.
Deleting my words now.
I saw you typing. I was waiting for it to come up on chat. I didn't know if it was a question or not. So I was like,
Jess, the youth that got together, that was under the auspices of Faith for Climate Action, or what was it? There was a hashtag associated.
Green Faith. Wait.
Yes.
Green Faith.
Green Faith.
Yeah. So it was Faith for Climate. Hashtag
Faith for Climate.
Yeah.
That's the one I saw.
Thanks, Mum.
Do we have an opportunity here? I mean, I think everybody who's said something has said the same message underneath. Individuals, you can do as much as you can, but together you can make a lot more. Well, people take notice, I guess. Is there an opportunity to put something other than a Facebook group together, because some of us refuse to use Facebook, a WhatsApp group or something, a bulletin board, something where we can post opportunities for action that people can subscribe to basically say, hey, here's an opportunity. I think somebody said swat a fly a day, find somebody, bring them along to come along to the same thing to support the causes. It's building that. It's the only way we're going to be able to move it forward, I reckon.
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure how. Well, it's not that how do we go about that, but I understand what you're saying, because obviously the younger generations are all across social media, everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for the older generations, or at least for my generation and mums and other people, your generation, I suppose, who, you know, might just need an email or a WhatsApp or something like that. That's definitely a really good idea, and one that we could potentially even take so far to the common prom and com, however you say which way around it.
proms and com.
Yeah, common prom group, because I mean, look, you know, we have a bereavement phone tree. We had a bereavement phone tree at one stage. You know, could we implement something similar for when something comes up that not only the TSA as a whole might like to stand behind, but the individuals of the TSA.
Yep.
And I mean, things like, you know, last Thursday, the bell ringing, the call for action against climate change. I mean, that was probably one of, if not the first thing, one of the very first things that the Temple Society Australia has sort of put their name to. So ultimately, we didn't expect a large turnout. As it was, we probably had over 15 people or something. So it definitely wasn't huge. But I think, like, you know, we've all been saying, once you sort of start the ball rolling, like obviously we're going to have more things like that come across our page, and that will try to get out, whether it's Facebook, online bulletin, template talk, or if we can start up, you know, a phone tree or something, then that will go down the line, because, you know, there's really no point in the TSA putting their name to something if, you know, we don't have everybody standing behind us, I suppose.
If I can borrow a line from my dear old mum, who, when I used to bounce ideas off her when we were in your youth group days and later days or whatever else, the answer always was, if you youngsters want it, we'll back you.
Mm.
So I reckon move it forward a generation and want to help.
Mm.
The ideas have to come from the youngsters, and I think us older generation, we've buggered it up for them. We want a chance to at least mitigate it.
Mm. Mm.
Well, the ideas are definitely there. I mean, even just we had, I think it was only, how many, Paul, maybe 4 or 5 of the younger ones last Friday night that sort of got together. And again, that's the first thing, you know, other than COVID, and they sort of got together quite regularly, you know, that wasn't a sort of an event thing or an outing thing. That was probably the first time they've come together just to talk about, you know, social and environmental justice issues. So again, you know, if we do that more on a regular basis, we might be able to gather more of a following of younger people, ergo creating more of a following of people standing behind them. So again, we're at the very beginning of something that, you know, the fact that we're just standing or sitting, you know, here talking today indicates that we're very much starting. And I think that's very important.
And maybe we can do that in both states. We can merge some of the people. Exactly. It's something that we can all unite behind.
Yeah.
Sorry, Karen, did you want to say something? No? Okay, sorry, it was just a off the place.
It's just a nod of yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think also, you know, Jess and Fred, with this, sometimes just if the kids have an idea that they want to run, or even if it doesn't have to be, it can be us at our generation. If there's something in this vein in terms of, you know, broader social and environmental good that we want to run, it doesn't. And the elders were, my understanding of this was, I was invited into a discussion with them, was that and their statement makes it really clear that not all Templars have to agree with what you know, an action that's proposed, but provided it's basically, you know, we're not going to march against wearing masks or something like that when we need to wear masks. If it's not that, then you know, it's okay for a bunch of people to be acknowledged and endorsed, you know, like given the blessing from the Temple Society to do something like this. And I find that when a group of people just start something and just go off and do one little action, whether it's a physical thing on the ground like tree planting, marching, could be any number of things, just helping out at a soup kitchen or something like that, with an organisation that may be outside the Temple Society, but we can slot into an action that they're doing very easily without too much organisation. What I think people just, young people and old people, they just get it and they want to do it again. It feels nice to do something like that, and people, you know, I think discussion's great, and then the next step would be just to get going, you know, not to worry too much about the ultimate, you know, first step, you know, just any step is going to be a good step.
Well, I think the first step came from the Regional Council to release that action plan, isn't it? Isn't that the first step? Then doing stuff is just enacting that action plan.
Yep.
And it sounds like from what Jess is saying, the youth have already started down that track. So maybe it's now just how do we facilitate it
and reinforce it and stand behind them and tell them,
yeah,
you know, you come up with the ideas, we'll support you. Fill they are.
Sounds good.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
I was wondering if Annette, she's a couple of little things come up in the chat. Did you have any thoughts, Annette? If you're still there, you're still with us? I can't see.
Yeah, she's still online. She's still online.
Yeah.
She just said we.
Yeah.
With a single E.
Sorry, guys.
Yes.
Yes. I'm still there. Look, it's interesting because I was just thinking, I was going to write, we can't even get recycling right at our school. That's dreadful. You know, I'm going around cleaning out the recycling bins all the time because people were chucking the wrong sort of stuff in there and putting up signs and say, do not put paper in here. This is for this, or this is for the printer recycling, what's her name? And, You know, I'm taking the coffee grounds from the machine all the time, putting it on my compost because they were just going in the bin and I couldn't stand it. And, you know, we've got an environmental group at the school and they were collecting all the, what do you call it, fruit and veggie scraps from the kitchen, but then there's no one to turn it over in the compost bin and they can't, you know, you can't, it's just, it feels like you're dragging this I don't know, inert mass along behind you, and there's just not enough people getting on board. But on the other hand, we are having a ride to school day tomorrow, so I'm dusting off the bike and going to try to ride my bike to school. So, you know, there is hope everywhere, and there are lots of people doing worthwhile things. So, I don't know. Sorry, I'm not being very articulate here.
Yeah. I was just thinking, our kids' school had a really good way of dealing with waste, and particularly compostable waste. And the reason is because the kids were engaged in a kitchen garden program, so they needed this nutrient to turn through the garden to make plants grow nice, and that was part of their curriculum. And it was, you know, the amount of kids proportionately that were playing around the garden, the school garden, you know, the food garden, at lunchtime, morning tea, compared to the tarmac, the asphalt, was huge. Yeah, it was a lovely place to be. So kind of when these kind of sometimes difficult things, but when you layer them with something else that's creative, all of a sudden they make more sense and they're more easily done, you know, because that's actually one of the principles of permaculture, which is that, you know, you never do anything just for one outcome. There's a whole bunch of reasons why so you get this kind of
holistic approach,
a holistic and sort of mutually supportive kind of thing happening, like occurs in nature.
Something which is,
unfortunately, it seems it needs a critical mass in there, Paul. At your kids' school, obviously there's a critical mass there. At a net school, it's one against the world. I have exactly the same problem at the place where I work, where I sort through I took the recycling bin away because all the rubbish went in the recycling bin, but then everything went into the rubbish bin. So I put the recycling bin back there, and when I empty the bins, I go through the rubbish bins. I'm like the old, the bag lady type thing, and it goes into my recycling bin at home. And I kept saying to people, what do you put in your recycling bin at home? It's scary.
My work actually just installed it's a 4-pronged bin, so it has paper, recycling, and it has one called landfill. And you feel guilty every time you put something in there that doesn't fit in with the other areas, because it's a visual, like it's written on there. It's quite big in red of all colours, but it's a visual reminder every time you blow your nose and you have a tissue or something that you need to put in there. And it hits you every time, because they've removed the bins from individual desks, and there's only these big 4 bins that everyone has to go there. And I don't know if that helps, but when you see the word landfill, it does resonate.
It actually works on peer group pressure as well, because people see what you're throwing into the bin.
Yeah, that's true.
It's really interesting just this little bit of a discussion, because in one part, we're talking about personal responsibility. Another part, you're talking about community action through, you know, and Fred, like you're saying, you know, like peer group pressure. That's kind of like a communal kind of driver. The other one that really worries me with regard to recycling at the moment, you know, I have no idea what happens with our, at the moment with our, commingled recycling waste in Australia. So we decided it was too expensive to process it here, so we sent it all to China. China decided it didn't want to take it anymore, which is fair enough. And what I've heard, and I actually don't know where these massive national volumes of commingled recycling waste actually goes to, because the decision was not to burn it in incinerators to generate electricity, which is probably a smart idea. But there's some awful, awful stories about where our commingled recycling waste is currently going. I don't know if does anybody know where it's actually, the bulk of it's going at the moment?
What's his name? Sean Rocastle on the ABC ran a series recently. I think effectively I don't know that there's any solid figures behind it, but basically it's been baled up and stuck into disused warehouses. Those disused warehouses basically are now chockers full.
That's what I've heard as well, that they're just banging it into warehouses until they can come up with some kind of solution that'll unpick it all.
Yeah, and so I think consequently, most of the recycling stuff that goes into your, in our case, blue lidded bins, every council's got a different coloured bin, not a problem. It's going into landfill.
Yeah.
And there's an issue too with some of those wastes when they're stored for a certain period of time, they suddenly they get to a point where they're no longer kind of thingamajigable, you know, like
they're not
recyclable.
I've heard awful stories about the federal government being complacent, or, you know, like basically letting the following thing happen, which is that this stuff goes on ships. It finds its way to countries like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, and it's almost like a mafia that sends the stuff there, and everyone turns a blind eye. And in those countries, a poor person will go to the port where the guy is actually basically dealing in waste, recyclable waste, and they will take a cubic metre or 2 cubic metres or 10 off the hands of these people, get paid some token amount of money, and then how they dispose of it is not of concern of the people in Australia. The government, not of concern of the people who take the stuff over there, and it ends up either in the sea or it's burnt, like literally put in a pile and just burnt, all that plastic and stuff. Imagine the poor people in those countries. I mean, not in my backyard, or it makes me so angry that this is happening. And so that's the thing about personal responsibility, community action, and then there's this other layer. I truly think we need to go to the leadership and jump up and down and say what is actually happening, and if it doesn't meet, basic environmental and community expectations, the government's got to move on this. I think it's all just gone quiet because it's just been put aside.
Yeah.
They're not going to be building warehouses every other week to store another huge kind of mountain of waste.
Jess actually raised a good point in the chat. If Germany can do it, why can't we, basically, in the rest of the world?
I think the answer is very simple, Michelle. There isn't a will to do it.
Yeah.
If there's a will
no
to do
economic
it,
return to do it, is there?
Well, that's the problem, and we always justify everything in economic return.
Yeah.
And there are sometimes things that you do because it's the right thing to do. It's got nothing to do with economics. And if you just now look at the COVID and the way the government has been able to print money to bail us out of it, they can print money to bail us out of all these other issues as well.
Interestingly, in Australia, at very least, the big four banks have basically said no more money for carbon hungry industry. So it's going to. Economy is the driver of it, but when the people who are providing the money to drive that economy are basically saying, well, hang on, you're not doing anything about it, we'll do something about it. Ethical investment houses, et cetera, no money for things that aren't carbon neutral and so forth. So slowly, but it needs more action. Those tipping points, some of them are already long past. We need to make sure no more new tipping points. So action as of yesterday.
Couple of things I could throw in here, pretty, I guess, controversial topics that we're discussing. But if you think very hard about them, then we go to a coffee shop near work, and we regularly joke about the fact that if we go to J-Car next door, we may as well buy the thing in J-Car and throw it in the bin on the way out the door, because the thing that's being sold is basically junk, and so. You got to think about the source of all this waste that we're talking about, and really what we're allowing to occur is for people to make lots of money from importing junk that has a very short lifespan and essentially make a lot of money out of it, or for us all to then throw it away a few days, weeks or years later. I go for a run around my block every now and then, and when there's hard rubbish collection, it stuns me the amount of flat screen TVs there are out on the hard rubbish. Why do we allow things that are junk to be sold in Australia? Number one. Number two, going to a much bigger issue, one thing that we discussed earlier is baseload power, which is a very controversial topic. And I think I agree with Paul Haar on the fact that, probably renewables can deliver baseload power, but I think the problem could be so urgent that we need to seriously consider some rapid deployments of alternative power sources. And one of the most controversial ones that could actually see us through a gap to becoming totally decarbonised is nuclear power. Now, no one likes nuclear power, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't generate CO2. So I'm not saying whether I'm for or against it, but there are some very safe technologies of nuclear power that we could employ for the next short period of time until we can decarbonise with renewables to prevent this catastrophe that we're all facing. I've listened to, I don't know if anyone's interested, but there's a very interesting podcast done by a German fellow in both English and German called Omega Tau. And he has recently done a podcast on nuclear power, and they're basically developing nuclear power plants of micro scales in shipping containers that could be deployed, built in factories and deployed very rapidly to essentially deliver power in a way that, okay, we cause waste issues that we all know about and we cause safety issues that we all know about, but we're getting to a point where the considerations of eliminating carbon from the atmosphere might become more pressing than some of the other concerns that we have to address. So something else for people to think about.
I realise it's probably a very naive view, but I've always wondered why we can't put all of that nuclear waste back into the mines where we dug it out from in the first place. The area is completely radioactive already. It's not enriched, I understand that, but why can't you just put it back where it came from? I don't think we should be filling up holes in the middle of South Australia, for example, that used to be mines with nuclear waste if there wasn't nuclear stuff there in the first place.
Well, apparently the Scandinavian countries have now are the first countries in the world to solve the nuclear waste problem. And they had multiple communities bidding to be the waste repository in places like Finland, because they understand that we have to decarbonise fast. They understand that we have to solve the waste problem, and they were willing to have the waste stored in their backyard. So that people, similar first world countries have overcome these problems and figured things out. Now, we can all debate long and hard whether nuclear power is the long-term solution, but I suspect we're coming to a point where we have to think long and hard about what the short-term solution is, not the long-term solution.
Agreed. I think the other thing which is really important is that we always, when we come against the negativity, particularly out of our political class, where they talk about how it's all jobs and, money and all the rest of it, they always talk down renewables, and I think there's not enough people that are talking up renewables. And to a large degree, because the power class have been able to talk down the scientists, they've made it so that anything to do with green is a scary thing, and you don't want change and stay back in your little hole and don't lift your head and sit under your mushroom. Whereas not enough people are standing up and saying, hey, these are actually really good things. There's a lot of truth that is being bent to become myth. And that's how they do it. They destabilize people's opinion by spreading myth. And we see that really beautifully in the last 4 years in the US, where 75 million people have actually been convinced that this guy's a hero, simply because he had a negative story that he told every single minute of every single day, and he had the airspace to be able to say it. And I think people who had a positive story were left behind. And I really think that's the other thing. People need to talk it up much more, really with a conscious effort. We're seeing it right now with the vaccines. The anti-vaxxers seem to be getting all the airtime. And the government is trying to put in place a program to speak up the value of the vaccine. And they're just not getting enough airtime because the anti-vaxxers are getting more. And unfortunately, some members of the government are a part of that coalition that do that. So, it really confuses the general population. And somewhere we need a circuit breaker that says, hey, this is rubbish. This is, I'll say it in my good slang, this is crap that you're talking. The real truth behind this is this. And if you don't want to believe it, well, this is how we can substantiate it. And, it's just a matter of overpowering the negative talk that is coming out in so many places. It's not just in the green activities. It's again the same thing that Jess was talking about. The social conscience is just not there to do those things. I fail to understand why all those guys are still on Manus Island. It just blows me away. 6 years. Why? Surely, you know, they've been punished enough for making the mistake of being a refugee. That sort of thing. There's just no social conscience. And so many people in our upper echelons who consider themselves to be good Christians, and I'll bring the religious element into it, consider themselves to be good Christians. They're only good Christians for what they believe is the right thing that they do. And it is a very, very, very narrow bandwidth of Christianity that they actually believe in. And that scares me probably a lot more.
And Theo, just, you know, I just can't help to constantly think about the Templars in Tatura, you know. So they came out as prisoners of war, but they were German nationals. So technically they were the enemy of, you know, of Australian soldiers and mums and dads whose sons and daughters were out fighting on the other side of the planet, maybe, you know, like to, and dying. And all of the Templars were in Tatura, from what I can gather. I don't know that there's one story of them being anything other than respected and you know, almost you know, like we're all the guards and the soldiers, the people who were like, look, were there guarding the place.
Yeah,
were only kind to them. So when they wanted to make a Weihnachtskultur, you know, they got these 2mm sheets of steel so they could fold up the things. Would you give that to a bloke on Manus Island now? You know, like, you know, they'll say, oh, they're going to, you know, they aren't even our enemies.
No.
Yeah? They're not even enemies. They are just people who, through misfortune, have ended up in Australia or, you know, try to get away, escape from where they think. And yet we can't give exactly what you're saying. We can't give them the respect that, you know, anything like the respect that they deserve. And as Templars, I think we really should be speaking up about that in the context of our own history and our legacy, and the fact that our generation has done well after our parents came to Australia, and Australia didn't reject them. In the camps, they were safe. They probably wouldn't have been safe in Germany or Israel, you know, as the war wrapping up. It just beggars belief. And so I just think there again on that whole thing of, you know, refugees and people in these detention centres, we really have an obligation as Templars to really speak up about that and highlight that difference. You know what I mean? That between whenever it was, the late 40s or the 40s and now, you know, in terms of social attitude.
Yep.
Anyone have any other comments? I'm conscious of the time. It's 9:15. Happy to keep going. We've had a few people drop off, but still happy to keep going if we'd like. I was hoping to say this to Christine, but I think she's left us, but she was saying she's now ready to walk on the next climate change. I think that was her rallies. So, yeah, we've now inspired her to march in the next climate change rally, which I think is fantastic.
Haven't heard from Pete. Haven't heard from Peter. Peter Honnold. Is you there, Peter? Just having a look and.
Yeah.
Peter has a shitty internet connection, so he's often delayed in terms of hearing.
He's just popped on.
No, he's been there. He's been there the whole time.
Oh, right. Okay.
And Dita and Tolde too. We haven't heard from them. No. Not that it's compulsory, but as long as we're not ignoring you or.
You hear our diatribe.
That's it.
Oh, thanks, Annette. Oh, she's left. Okay.
But guys, I need to drop off as well, so I'll just say good night. Paul, thanks ever so much for a great presentation. Everyone else, good luck, best wishes, and we'll see you on another one of these in a few months.
Yeah, on Sunday.
Yes. Thanks again.
Oh yeah, we'll be on the paddock on Sunday too. Okay, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello.
See you
later.
See you, Alfred. Good to see you.
We'll catch up soon.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night. See you.
So good initiative, Michelle. I presume you were the mover and shaker to get this thing up and running, and for Paul to accept the invitation. I guess, Paul, you've probably spoken at a lot of things on similar. It's very near and dear to your heart.
I've never talked about climate change in itself before. It was a bit scary.
Yeah, but you've obviously pulled those figures. You've found the sources to support the discussion. So it's something obviously that's near to your heart. So, and I'm glad you had the Candlebark School in there as well, because otherwise I would have suggested to people they have a look at it, because I'd still love to think that what we may build as a community hub at Bayswater might be modelled on something very, very similar to sustainable materials, ecologically designed and stuff like that. So, and I think I went down and talked very quickly to the kids when you're on the paddock the other night. Basically, say if you've got any ideas that you want to incorporate it into something that might be a new building, speak up now. Don't be afraid to speak, because now's the opportunity.
That's good. Yeah.
And I think the reason I did this too was the only way to facilitate change is to start the discussion.
Absolutely.
And so this is a great starting point, and I'm happy to do another one in a subtopic. If anyone has any ideas, if you want to email me, it's just michelle@templesociety.org.au, but I'm open. I haven't scheduled the next topic yet. So if there is something that branches off from this that we think is worthwhile, I'm happy to facilitate it.